evening, Graham, and good evening to our very special guest tonight, Rob Cowen, our first returnee, Rob, actually. So thank you for coming back to us and not being put off from the first time you spoke with us. That's always reassuring. And welcome tonight.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, as ever.
Good, glad to hear it. So our guest tonight, Rob Cohen, written a new book. That's one way of putting it, and this is a book called North Road, published by my namesake Hutchinson, but no relative Heinemann. And when was it released, Rob? What was the release date?
Last week, I think.
Last week.
17th.
Yeah,
No, sorry, 2 weeks ago, 17th. Yeah.
17th. Excellent. So this is the latest wonderful creative work from Rob. And Graham, maybe just a little bit of background, if you would, on Rob. We can even let Rob do that if you wish. But Graham, maybe you just have a quick word there.
Well, the North Road is subtitled "A Journey Through Time, Place, and Memory,"
Mm.
which is sort of slightly what Common Ground, Rob's previous non-fiction book released in 2015, was about. But this is a massive step forward, which I think is why it's been received so brilliantly right across the board. Everybody seems to love it. It's get a lot of attention. It's basically Common Ground. I was going to say it's Common Ground on steroids, but it's it's better than that because it takes everything Common Ground had in terms of the style and puts way more detail and way more structure. So when I read the first two chapters of the North Road,
Mm.
I actually started to well up because I thought, oh my God, it's absolutely perfect. He's
Mm.
absolutely nailed the whole thing. It's such an ambitious concept because it isn't just about Rob walking along the A1, all 400 miles of it. It's got everything in it, but it's structured in such a beautifully coherent, but always to the point type way. It you can't call it meandering because it's always making a point. Every sentence counts on every single pages.
Mm.
It's just an immense achievement.
Rob, how do you react to that description from Graham?
Well, that's a very generous and a very profound reading of it. And he's as I would expect from Graham Chalmers, he's really hit the nail on the head, which is it is this kind of, if Common Ground was this kind of square mile of edgeland, the North Road is really it's kind of like an epic widescreen road movie.
Mm.
It's interrogation of time, of place, of memory, of identity, of history, of all these elements that are interwoven in what I think of as the Great British Mother River, which is the A1, the Great North Road, and its various incarnations. And this thing is actually, it's part of the sort of grim grey web of infrastructure necessary for our existence. But fundamentally, it's a timeline. It's a repository of memory, and
Mm.
it is something by which we can read British history all the way back to, well, to the Romans as a road as we understand it, but actually far further anyway, more like 7,000 years, to
Yeah.
when there are Neolithic trackways running up through North Yorkshire. So no, Graham's reading is bang on. It is an urgent book. It's a book that is written over probably the most politically kind of fractious and unstable period of our history since World War II. I started walking it in 2016 around the EU referendum. Obviously, COVID was in there, but all these kind of time rhymes and echoes that occur in the book, when you interrogate the history of this road, seem to be playing in the present. And this is a kind of theme that runs throughout, is the fact that the past is very proximate on this road. You're never away from it. If you remove the kind of the traveling at 70 miles an hour in a self-contained air-conditioned vehicle, if you
Mm.
take that out of the equation and you walk it on foot, then it is like unspooling footage, from an old movie that you look through. And everywhere you go, there is this relics and these kind of interstitial moments that leach through the fabric. And so, yeah, I think Graham's nailed it there. I mean, that is what it is. But it's a story of this road. It's a story of our history and time, but it's a story of me and my time and
Mm.
what roads lead us to where we end up. And also the story of my great grandfather, who is a
Yes.
kind of spectre in this book. All the way he
Bill
walks
Cannon.
through, manifests. Bill, yeah, Bill.
Yeah.
So it's kind of all these three narratives braided together and, explored. I think in a way, I said this the other day to somebody, that fundamentally all of my books, Common Ground, The Heeding, this one, they all kind of have three core questions at their heart. And those core questions are, who are we? How do we get here? Where are we going? And they try and sort of interrogate that a bit. But, in a way that ask those questions in a personal capacity, but also a national capacity, and also a global capacity, looking at ourselves as people. And I think this road actually is, if you like, this repository of memory is a far truer reflection of those things than, let's say, the curated museums or National Trust properties that we like to go to for our history and our kind of our understanding of those things.
Is that partly that it's a living history? I mean, as a road, it's a backbone of Britain, and obviously the M1 might want to make a counter claim to that, but it seems to me it's very much the backbone. It's alive every day, as it were. It has the blood running through it, obviously, as vehicles moving. It has tributaries off to it, off to the sides. So on any journey upwards, you could go off and visit Margaret Thatcher's Grantham. You could visit Oliver Cromwell's Huntington. So you've got steeps. Two of the most significant historic figures are connected in their own way with this road. Their living history of what Cromwell did to this country, what Margaret Thatcher did to this country, and that must have been partly influenced by where they grew up, effectively on this route.
Oh, it's fundamentally influenced, and it's the reason that the A1 has this aura. The Great North Road has this aura that the M1 doesn't. I mean, early on in the book, I quote a truck driver called Joe Doyle, who is a lifer, if you like, on the lorries and the trucks, and he says, that he takes the A1, even though the M1 is far quicker, but he does that because the road has this possessive quality, this idea of possessing him, has this aura. And he's a very unromantic human being, but he just said, the A1 is a disease you can't get out of your blood. And I think that's kind of summed up. There is something about it, and it is, I think, these layers of history, this aura that it has, these resonances that you can't help but feel. And you're absolutely right, Charles, to reference these repetitions. You've got all of this history on this road. If you start at London at Smithfield, you've got, you start at London Bridge, you've got the Roman history, you've got Smithfield, you've got the drovers and the history of, if you like, barbarism in a sense, and the fact that, Smithfield was also where people were killed when they were, when Tyburn was too good for them. So William Wallace was killed at Smithfield, famously. Various dissenters and heretics. Say
very
again?
Gruesomely. He was killed very gruesomely.
It was a he was I mean, there were a few killed in that manner, but he was killed on the eve of what was the equivalent of Glastonbury at the time, which was this greatest congregation of people in England at St. Bart's Fair at Smithfield. And he was killed there as a way of the crown and the city making a point, which is that you don't mess with us, and if you do mess with us, this is what happens to you. So there was an early power-based dynamic, but you've got the crushing of the Peasants' Revolt in the same place 70 plus years later. But then you've got all of these histories coming up here. You've mentioned it. Cromwell, Charles Stuart, the Civil Wars, which are so present and they echo through our time to this day. And certainly with Brexit, the fact that you could overlay a map of the people who are for the king and who are for Parliament over a map of Brexit voters, and it's exactly the same split. Those for the king voted to leave, and those for Parliament voted to remain. And you can overlay those two maps, and it's a really extraordinary echo.
Yeah.
So you have that. You have, as you mentioned, you've got Isaac Newton at Woolsthorpe, literally beside the Great North Road, making these enormous discoveries, which not just changed physics, but changed everything. Because in England, we had a closer link. We took Newtonian physics and we applied it very early on. In France, there was still Descartes, they were still using other physicists and other thinkers. But we early on adopted Newtonian physics and said, this is the truth. This is the only truth. And then we therefore disseminated it for entrepreneurs, for factory owners, for shop floors. And so there was this Newtonian physics pushed England and Britain into being the first industrialized country in a way. So we were industrializing a decade before anyone else, which meant we had the steel and everything. That was all down to the discoveries that he made in that house beside the road. You've got the Mayflower, the Pilgrim Father, William Brewster, and the man who organized the Plymouth colony, William Bradford, are both living close to each other on the Great North Road. William Brewster was a postmaster on a leg of the Great North Road between Scrooby and Doncaster, and that was massively influential on his life and how and why he left for America. But yeah, all the way you've got these histories that are just sort of profoundly nation shaping and altering all the way up, and that's before you even talk about battles and conflicts and engagements. Yes. So it's we think of it, you're right, we think of it as this kind of, and it is a working road, but it's working in that other sense too, as in cogitating and fermenting and alive. And that's why it's kind of fascinating as a thing, and it's also why people feel connected to it, I think.
Graham?
The book's called The North Road, but in a way, and Rob has just illustrated what I'm about to say, because he's packed in lots of information there, and that's probably only one page of the book in total. But the book, in a way, isn't really about the road at all. It's more like a tapestry of life, or even more than that, it's more like an alternative history of Britain.
Yeah.
It's not the Times history of Britain. It's not the Henry VIII and the Six Wives history of Britain that most of the mainstream historians and newspapers go on about. This is the real, wide, encompassing, all angles, real history of Britain.
And I think, thank you, but I think it's where those histories influence the present still, I guess, is a way of thinking of what's distilled in this book. Is, when I was walking through Scrooby and looking at this Mayflower trip, it was at a time when Elon Musk was promising to send people to Mars, and he was calling it the Mayflower moment, and you think of that colonizing of that coast of America by the Pilgrim Fathers, and then, and to them, they were religious extremists. A lot of people don't realize they were extraordinarily extremist religious people. They weren't going out there for venture capital, although they were funded by the City of London, and they bought stocks in their own company that was funding them. So, this stuff was nascent venture capitalism, but they went out there and they took the risk of having to survive, having to get on with the indigenous populations, trying not to be killed, trying to survive through the seasons, because they wanted this religious kind of community they could build where they practice their faith freely and live freely and according to their terms. The problem was they were only half the people who went. The other people weren't the saved people. There were people who were trying to get out of England because they had other reasons to leave, and they were escaping the law or debt or whatever else, or scandal. And so you had this, it was a doomed project from the off, in the sense that you had this kind of, and William Brewster writes about it, how kind of heartbroken he is that all these kind of crimes occur in this saved community almost immediately, like hideous crimes, bestiality. He's complaining about having to whip people for stuff, and very soon the project fails. But what it does do is it succeeds in this new kind of opportunity, which is that profit leaps and bounds because they start to make great kind of inroads into America, and they start to take land which doesn't belong to them. So the deals they make with the native populations soon, they only really last as long as the settlers want them to, and then they break them, and then they push for more land, and they have this huge war, which is decisive. And then they just, as soon as this word gets back along the North Road about success in America, about freedom, about the potential to make money and to do well, people are flooding over, and they're pushing and pushing further west. And of course, this eventually results in the manifest destiny of the 19th century, the pushing west, and this kind of justification for robbing land and taking it off indigenous populations because it's not being worked properly, this kind of Protestant mindset. But you see this kind of American model where colonizing, dominating, just obliterating, and driving all the way to the west, then turning around and going, oh, well, what else is there now? We've got all this land. And then you have this sort of this parallel with Musk saying, oh, we want to land on Mars, and we want to colonize space, and we want to do this. And what there isn't ever in this mindset is a focus on making heaven on earth, which is what the original Pilgrim Fathers were trying to do, is to create a piece of heaven on earth. And we live on this earth. And it was a kind of a moment where I was walking through Scrooby, where there were these two headlines, and one was Musk saying, oh, 2050 is the date by which we will be on Mars. This will be the Mayflower moment for our world and for our space travel. And then on the other headline, it was 2050 is the date by which the Earth will rise to 1.5 degrees, and large portions of it will be unlivable. And you had this kind of weird tension, which is so present to this day, of, are we trying to make this world? Are we trying to sort out the problems of this world? Or are we just allowing this world to go to hell in a handcart while these elite billionaires build new colonies on their own terms somewhere else? And it just, it strikes you as terrifying when you see time just flip into the present like that.
It's all going very Blade Runner, basically.
Sadly so. Yeah. I mean, it's the dystopia that you sense in these kind of historical rhymes. I was reading something today where it struck me because when I started writing this, there was all this narrative stuff going on about the EU referendum, and a lot of what I was reading was just cartoonish. It was just fake, and it was lies, and this kind of constructed narrative about British history that was picking and choosing moments of glory and then sort of twisting them to say, well, these are reflective of certain things. And of course they're not. And they are a very one-sided and minuscule kind of perspective on British history. But even today, it seems like we've given up on truth being important. And, I watched a debate on TV today where, Nigel Farage can go on camera and say, oh, there's no point doing, green energy because it's more expensive and it's the reason energy is rising. Now, that's been disproved by every single body that is not the reason that energy is prices are rising. We know that's not the reason. The reason is because we're dependent on gas, and gas is very expensive because of the Ukraine war. But he can say something that's patently untrue and say it on national TV and not have to justify the fact that it is untrue. What a bizarre situation, because suddenly they're winning by-elections reform based on what is fundamentally untrue and a lie. And I really worry about that, because in our history, and the road will point this out to you, when something like that happens, there's only one ending, and it's not a good one. If you just allow lies to manifest and be told and retold as truth, and you aren't challenging it, and the mainstream media isn't challenging it and saying, I refuse to allow you to say that because it's untrue. We let it go with Brexit, and look what happened. We let it go. Untruth after untruth. No, it doesn't matter. It's just an opinion. But no, because people are led by these untruths, because people are hurting at the moment. And, I find that extraordinary. But, to your point, Graham, I think what I'm trying to get to in this book is a truer analysis of history, a more rational analysis of history, an objective analysis of history, that says, look, yes, there are moments of great glory in our history, and who would deny that? Of course there are. Of course there are. Most of my ancestors are involved in them, but there are also great moments of shame, and you can't just have the glory without the shame. You can't just have half an understanding of how we ended up where we are right now, because you'll never address the issues and you'll never find a road ahead.
Well, they're abusing the past to win the present day to change the future, is what they're doing. So, as usual, history is used as a weapon in a political battle.
Correct. Yeah.
I was going to say something quite long-winded, so I'll try and make it short. But I mean, the North was a massive work of research. There's probably like 15 bits of research in every page. It isn't just inspiration and imagination. It's got archaeology, architecture, culture, politics, economics, social history, autobiography, family stories, family history. And I was watching a film at the weekend by Chris Pettit and Ian Sinclair, made in 2002 for Channel 4, called London Orbital, based on Ian Sinclair's book about the M25. And J.G. Ballard pops up, and the film's very impressionistic and non-linear. It's a bit like an art installation, really. And I suddenly thought, although Rob writes award-winning nature books, I don't think Rob really is a nature writer. He's more in the lineage of, say, Ian Sinclair or J.G. Ballard, who all were influenced by Guy Debord and the Situationists in France in the 1960s in psychogeography. He's more in that lineage than, strictly speaking, a nature writer. Do you think that's a reasonable interpretation?
Yeah, well, I've never, as you know, Graham, after our many nights together in the pub, but I've never called myself a nature writer. I think it was a term that was attached to me because Common Ground was about a patch of. I mean, I've always written about people and place and time, and they're the things I write about. It's just that Common Ground covered a patch of this wild, kind of exuberant, natural edgeland, if you like. So most of the characters in it were connected to nature, if you like, in that very profound sense. But nature writing, I think, is a genre that developed 20 years ago as a concept because there was an absence of describing genre that fit what you're talking about, the kind of psychogeographical, situationist, but also, the interweaving of memoir and the writing about the natural world, particularly at that time, in a way that wasn't just dry history or, kind of, compendium of birds or whatever. There was a profound imperative to engage with the natural world at that point because of the crisis that was looming. And also to kind of bring in new forms of literature. So, when I wrote Common Ground, it was doing something different in that it interwove fictional chapters and, well, they're kind of creative nonfiction, to be honest. They were based on real people, but they were written from the perspective of, not my perspective, but their perspective. So people put it into nature writer because I think they felt they weren't comfortable calling it nonfiction. So it kind of, I fell into that genre because what I was doing was different to everybody else. And now, funnily enough, this has become accepted because this book is described as nonfiction. Okay, so it's not nature writing; it's described as nonfiction. And I was very clear that was important to me because I don't see it as nature writing, and I don't see myself as a nature writer. I see myself as a writer on people, place, and time. And I think it's an interesting point. But what's also interesting in that point is that I interweave these fictional chapters in this book too. And you have chapters written about the harrying of the North, which is like very in the present, and people trying to escape this kind of this being killed by William the Conqueror's men in 1069, 1070. And you have chapters written from the perspective of Captain James Hind, the highwayman, giving his last testament in a jail. You have these various chapters, the perspective of a salesman traveling up the road and trying to live with memory and music, and all of them fit with the road, because what I'm trying to do here is tell the road story, and in so doing tell a story of all the people who've passed up and down its countless unremembered that have moved up and down this road for the last, God knows how many centuries. So, yeah, it's funny, but that's now accepted. People aren't going, hang on a minute, it's not nonfiction because there's weird fiction chapters in it. They're now going, no, that is nonfiction. And I think Common Ground opened the doors for that in a way. Let that be accepted.
Rob, we think of a world of the north-south divide, but the Great Road, of course, its job is to connect north and south, south and north. And I wonder if the history of this road actually goes against the idea of a north-south divide. That's too simplistic an image of the north is such and such, the south is such and such. By actually walking this road and seeping all these stories into you, it's a more complete picture that isn't of a north-south divide. It's something different, actually.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I think it's been a search, and it's been a stitch. It stitched the north and the south together, and and I think that's true. I think when the Romans invaded successfully, Caesar tried to invade twice and failed, but when they invaded successfully and Claudius did his little show trial and took the southeast, you ended up with a situation where the Romans built the first roads. They looked at what was happening in Britain and they regarded it as separate principalities that were all interlinked. And they were. And up here we had the Brigantes, as we know. You had the southeastern tribes. Every single area was localized. It worked in a local kind of methodology and thinking. Roads, apart from these kind of old Neolithic, Mesolithic trade routes that ran up and down and to the coasts, you had these roads made sense on a local scale. And the Romans came along and said, this is crazy. You're one province. From south to north, you're one province. And we are going to build this new point where the Thames and Watling Street meet. And you can bring all the empire shipping up the River Thames. And we're going to build this crossing point. We're going to make it the center of a radial pattern. We're going to have roads going north and south and east and west. And they're still the major roads that exist in Britain this day. When you look at the A to Z, and the North Road, the original North Road, went straight north up to Lincoln. Didn't need to come up any further because the Brigantes were a client state for the Romans. Then only when that revolution happened did they push to north to York, and then further. But they regarded this island as one province. And then the people who lived here regarded it as all these tiny, weeny principalities. So I always remember that, and you have various nation-shaping battles that occurred on the North Road, which altered the geography of these islands. But fundamentally, I've always kind of felt that the road, what the road does when you follow it, is take you through these kind of extraordinary localities. So for example, the atmosphere changes when you move through certain places. If you're walking through, London, you have this intensity and density of all this city. The history of the city of London is just completely overwhelming as soon as you start investigating it. But as soon as you're out of it and you're into the hinterlands, past the North Circular, past the M25, you're suddenly in a different space, and the atmosphere changes. And we found on those first 50 miles, you get to sort of Bedfordshire. It's a completely different atmosphere. And it feels different. But, the color of the stone and the earth changes. So you get to a section where, near Stretton, for example, where the Ramjam Inn is, the stone just becomes butter colored. And it's this Clipsham stone, which is very famous. But then go further north, you start to see the first red brick stuff happening. So you move between these different localities that are much kind of more interesting than just saying north and south. And of course, when the coaching age, which was when the road was in its heyday, latterly 1780 to 1830 roughly, it was essential that these coaches moved through the villages and towns. That was essential because you had to change the teams of horses, you had to refresh, you had to do all this stuff. And so these towns were extraordinarily important. And what you would have seen if you were riding on those coaches was a completely different. You would have heard an accent change. You would have heard the have seen the colors of the buildings change. You know, the food would have been different because it was all local food and what have you. So it would have been extraordinary to travel through, but you wouldn't have thought of a north and a south particularly. You would have thought of where you were at that point because it would have been different. And so and then when you get further north, of course, you know, I think what's the other interesting thing about locality is that even in Scotland, it was called the Great North Road, but obviously it was a Great South Road to Scottish people.
Yeah.
So it's funny how it had its own kind of very real identity up to that point. And you know, depending.
That's because the Scots who are mainly populated in the central belt or even a bit below it, they look on anything beyond Stirling as like the north anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's a great line in the that I put in the book, which was a quote from someone, which is like, you know, where is the north anyway? Well, if you're you know, if you're on the Humber, it's the Tweed. You know, if you're on the Tweed, it's the Orcades, as he calls it, or whatever. Like you keep going further north. So no, it's an interesting question. I think there are times when there were definitive ideas of north and south, and one of them was during Thatcher when she took a match to the Keynesian consensus and just, you know, closed down mining and manufacturing in the north. And at that point, I think you had this very real split between north and south, where the north was anything beyond the M25, and the south was basically southeast and the city. And you know, you had traveling fans going up to you know, Sheffield, who were coming up from London, football fans who would throw money at the crowd, like loads of money, you know, oh, you're all pomos, you know. And so you had a very real sense of north and south at that point, I think. And of course, obviously, in certain periods of our history, you know, the north and the south was an identity that you would attach yourself to. But it changes, like the road does all over. It depends what epoch you turn the clock back to, as does the route of the road, though. So, you know, one of the things that's fascinating about the road is that it was constantly evolving. It was this enduring thing. What remains? The road remains always, you know. Frank Morley, in his book about the road, was picking about the rubble of the Blitz, and he said, he asked the question, what remains? And he looked at this road running north, which had been exposed by the Blitz bombing, and he said, the road, that's what remains. It's still there. It's still running. And it is still running now, you know. And so, yeah, I think it's this strange enduring timeline that's also evolved and had different identities and multiplicities. And that's what makes it interesting. And that's also what makes it navigable on foot, because you don't have to always walk the howling carriageways. You can go off on the old roads.
Is it too simplistic to suggest that the Great North Road is an organic road and the M1 is a manufactured road?
No, that's exactly what it is. That is exactly it. It isn't a committee agreed road. It isn't a sort of pre-designed. It's an evolution of Roman road, pilgrim path, medieval trackway, coach road, turnpike, motorway. It's all of those things, and it's done through use. So, you know, it was called the Great North Road. You know, you had these various incarnations. It was called the North Road. It was called the Old North Road. It was called the Great North Road, depending which map or time you're looking at. But what was agreed was that this was the most important arterial route in Britain, because in 1921, after World War I, there was a shying away from calling anything great because of the Great War, and the Great North Road had to alter its identity, and it became Alpha 1. They started this record of what all the roads were going to be called, and Alpha 1 was the most important road, and that was given to this road for that reason, because it was the most important. And I would contend that it remains the most important, really.
I've got a
Graham?
silly question for you, Rob. A silly question. One of the things that distinguishes you from other great writers like Robert McFarlane is that I think at your heart you're a bit of a rock and roller. So when I got to page 34 and you suddenly put time flows on within us and without us, I went, yay, Sergeant Pepper. Then you
Yep.
referenced Dark Side of the Moon on page 87. Then you talk
Yep.
about the time you were in a band years ago and you played the Hope and Anchor in London where the Clash had played and U2 and the
Yeah.
Police. And I just thought, good on Rob for getting his great love in. But my silly question is this: if you'd stuck to the band, could there have been the Clash? Could there have been U2?
It's a good question. Well, the funny thing about that question, Graham, is that I was talking about you this week as well, because yes, there's all this music. Music is, I was, one of the things the book deals with is my parents getting divorced when I was 15, and the kind of emotional, destructive elements that brought upon my life. And part of the book is me at the age of 40 with 2 children of my own, trying to ensure that I'm not passing those more destructive traits on, And one thing people don't tell you when you have children is, it's also a way of reliving your own childhood through them. And, those roads ahead suddenly become roads back through memory. So there is an imperative to process our own history, not just our national history, but our own personal history, and to come to terms with it and with its glory and shame and everything else, and then to make sure that we're not handing these things on, the more destructive things.
You've been listening to the podcast Two Big Egos in a Small Car. Your hosts were Graham Chalmers and Charles Hutchinson. This was a Baltic sub-production.